Hey South Hills, this month, November, is considered Foster Care Awareness Month. On any given day, there are nearly 437,000 children in foster care in the United States. This is one of the reasons why we are honored and excited to be partnering with an incredible organization during this month. Olive Crest is an amazing organization that is dedicated to preventing child abuse by strengthening, equipping, and restoring children and families in crisis, one life at a time. They care for entire families by offering support and services like preventative care, fostering, adoption, assistance for young adults, and so much more. You may not know this about me, but bringing awareness to foster children is really close to my heart. And the reason why is because this is the avenue and the road that God allowed me to become a dad. When my wife and I decided to start having children, we assumed that we were gonna have children like most people do. And for some reason, that was not the avenue that God had in mind for us. As we started to attempt to have children, year after year, we had come across challenges of not being able to. And as we consulted with doctors, we came to realize that there was no reason for us to not be able to have children. But at the end of the day, it wasn't God's plan. And so sure enough, as we looked at all the different avenues, we decided to go down the road of foster adoption. And we came across an amazing opportunity for us to be blessed with amazing children that we absolutely love and adore, and that could not be better children for us. It has been the greatest joy of my heart to be able to be a father, to be able to raise children, to be able to provide a home for them, to be able to allow God to speak into their hearts and see their gifts and their passions be explored, to be able to live a life that God has called them to. As we have gone down this journey, so many people have looked at us and said, man, what an amazing opportunity you've provided for those kids. And I say, you got it all wrong. Those kids have changed my life and have allowed me to be a father that God had called me to be. Were their lives changed? Absolutely. But my life was changed in this process. And I'm excited to see what next story is going to be coming out of our South Hills Church, where someone sitting in a seat today is going to open up a prayer and open up their heart and say, God, is this the road you have for me? Is this the journey that you have in store for me to be able to be a father or a mother or to have a family? Or God, are you simply just asking me to be involved with this organization? Whatever the journey is for you, I'm just asking for you today to consider what can you do to make a difference inside the lives of these children. And I'm excited to see how God will use us as a church, as individuals, to make a difference in the lives of the kids and families in our communities.
As we get going this morning, I do have a confession, and that is that I don't feel the same way about every series that we tackle, that we cover, all the different topics, all the different conversations that we have. Some of them are in my wheelhouse, and I love talking about them. Some of them are not in my wheelhouse. Some come really naturally and easy for me, and others don't. And honestly, I get really apprehensive and anxious anytime we're going to be talking about money in church. And we don't actually do it that often, but when we do, I have all kinds of emotions and nerves around it. And I think it's for a couple of different reasons. The first is that I don't really feel qualified. Like, I'm not Dave Ramsey. In fact, I'm far from it. I've done a lot of really dumb things with money. Anybody else willing to join me in that? You've done a lot of really dumb things with money. And I don't have a great history managing money all that well. Like, in fact, without my wife Hansi and her discipline and sort of her like wizardry, like, we would have been sunk really, really early on in our marriage. And some of you are too young to remember this, but anybody remember the days before we had all the apps and the programs and all the ways of different tracking all your money? And you you had to actually balance your checkbook. Anybody remember those days? I mean, yeah, that was a lot of fun, right? And I understood the idea. It wasn't that I didn't get it, but you might as well have asked me to like map the human genome just to get my checkbook to balance it just wasn't going to happen. And it, I didn't start off very well financially as a young adult. I don't know if you remember this. Maybe if you're a certain, I don't think they actually do this anymore. I think they like made a law or they banned it, but like it used to be that when you signed up for college and like you showed up on campus, like there were just credit card companies on campus with booths, just like signing all the students up like at the very beginning of the semester, giving them credit cards. And it was like Oprah giving out like cars at Christmas time. It was like, you get a credit card and you get a credit card and everybody gets a credit card. And mine actually had a $300 limit, the card I got when I went to college. And it was maxed out in about 3 hours when I got it. And I can tell you, though, I ate good that day, all right? That one day, I ate really good. But that started a pattern that would take a couple of decades and many thousands upon thousands upon tens of thousands of dollars to break. And so that's sort of my financial background. Now, that's the good news about this series is that it's not based on what I could tell you about money. It's not based on my ideas of what blessed means, but it's based on what God actually says and what God says about us being blessed. So I'm a spender, and they tell you, you're supposed to like marry a saver, but I'm a spender. Thankfully, I did marry a saver. And the good news is that I've been a pastor the whole time we've been married, so we've had these huge pastor's salaries to live on. So there's been that, but that means that we spent an overwhelming majority of the last 27 years completely and totally broke. Now, thankfully, like I said earlier, like I married a saver, and so we weren't completely destitute or homeless. Now, I share all of that so that you can know that no matter where you're at in this conversation or what your background or history is with money, that you can know that this conversation is for you. Now, the second reason I get anxious about talking about money is because it's just uncomfortable. Like money is so personal to us. And oftentimes when money is talked about in church, it can feel like a fundraiser, right? Like where the goal is to get you to give more. And I can tell you, as sure as I'm standing here today and as God is my witness, he can hear me talking to you. Like I can promise you that is not my goal in this series. Like, in fact, we actually set our teaching agenda over a year in advance. And in fact, I leave this afternoon. I'm flying to Southern California because myself and a few of the other pastors with our organization, we get together every November. We spend 2 or 3 days talking and praying and planning and arguing about what the next year is going to be like and planning out all of the conversations that we're going to cover during that year. Now, we sometimes make adjustments as we go along, but for the most part, we spend 2 or 3 days just planning out what it's going to look like. So this conversation is not a response to anything that's happening in the world right now, although it seems to be pretty good timing. It's not a response to anything that's happening in our church because it was decided last November. And so now I'll tell you up front, we are going to talk at some point in this series about giving and tithing and what God's heart is in each of those things. And there's going to be opportunities and maybe even a challenge or two for you to give along the way. And some of them have to do with our church, but some of them don't. Some of them are going to be about Boise Angels and foster kids. But I can tell you truthfully, regardless of any of that my goal and my heart in this series isn't to try to get you to give more money to South Hills. My goal is exactly what the title of this series suggests. I want for your life and for your family to experience what it means to be blessed. Not in a cheesy or cheap or Instagram sort of way, but in the truest sense. Like whether you have a lot or a little, I want for you and your life and your family to truly and genuinely be blessed by God. And so I'm going to do my best to sort of humbly tell you what I believe that God says to us in the scriptures about money and the meaning of what it actually looks like to be blessed. And then you can just decide to do with it whatever you want to do with it. Now, honestly, there are all kinds of ways that the word blessed gets used or defined in our culture. Hashtag blessed is a thing on social media. Just pull up Instagram like I did this week and just plug it into the search. And I went down like a rabbit hole of like 45 minutes just looking at Instagram posts that were hashtagged with #blessed. And it was about what you might expect. There were lots of cars, lots of pictures of vacation, lots of people eating, lots of purses and clothing, and a crap ton of mirror pics of dudes flexing, saying #blessed. A lot of them, all right? And I just was like, why are you hashtagging that? And like, put a shirt on, dude. Nobody wants to see that. Apparently, guys really think that the rest of the world wants to see us with our shirts off. But what was interesting about all of those kinds of posts is that there were just as many of those kinds of posts that mentioned God and listed a Bible verse as the ones that didn't. Now, there's obviously nothing wrong with any of those things except for maybe flexing. But it does beg the question, is that all there is to being blessed? Like having the best food and the best clothing and the best workouts and the best cars and the best vacations and the best houses and the best beautiful bodies that money can buy? Like, is that really what it is? Because as much as we all want those things, we intuitively know, at least there's something I think inside of us that says there's got to be more to it, because that just seems really like a really shallow meaning of what it means to be blessed. But it genuinely and truly can be confusing even when you look at the Bible. I mean, James chapter 1, verse 17, James was the half-brother of Jesus. He wrote these words in this letter. He said, everything good comes from God. Well, that is true, and that makes sense. So does that mean like if you look around your life and you have all of the good things that money can buy, that you're blessed? The problem is we've all known people that would fit into that category, but their lives were a mess and they didn't seem to be all that blessed. But then in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus actually gives a list of what blessed looks like. And the very first thing that he says is, blessed are the poor. Now, that's not where he stops. There's a second half to that statement. But if you're in the crowd that day, there's a part of us that thinks like, who really cares what he says after that, right? Because nobody's running towards poverty of any kind. So what do we do with that? And just because you're poor, does that mean you're blessed? Then a guy named Paul, who comes along after Jesus, he ended up writing most of what we call the New Testament. He's talking about him and his friends. And he says this in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 10. He's like, we own nothing, and yet we have everything, which sounds really, really cool. But also, I don't know about you, to me, it kind of just sounds like one of those things that people with nothing tell themselves to feel better about their situation. We got nothing, guys, but we got everything. Right? No, you don't have anything. And what does he actually mean by that? Well, and then there's just the piece of like throughout history, there have been all these different Christian voices that have assigned different levels of spirituality to whether you're poor or wealthy. And some have basically been like, well, Jesus was poor and he didn't have anything or own anything, and so we should just be poor because then we would be like Jesus. And then there's other people that argue, no, wealth and being rich and having a lot of stuff, that's a sign of God's favor and his blessing. And I think just taking both of those sort of ideas, like neither of them is actually correct. Because when you read the scriptures, what you begin to realize is that you can be poor and blessed, but you can also be poor and not blessed. That you can be wealthy and blessed, but you can also be wealthy and not blessed. I think we have like a little graphic for that. There we go. Right? Like you can be in any of one of those four categories. And so if that's true, obviously we'd all want to end up in that top right box, right? And we know we certainly want to avoid the bottom left. Nobody wants to be poor and not blessed. But I wonder, just, you don't have to say anything. Just think to yourself, I wonder how many of us wouldn't admit it out loud, especially at church. But if we had to choose, right, between the other two choices that are there, right, between being wealthy and not blessed and poor and blessed, how many of us would take our chances and roll the dice and opt for the bottom right long before we chose the top left? Now, if that's you, I'm not judging you at all. Honestly, I get it, because there's a huge part of me that's just like, I don't even really know what blessed is, so I'll just take the money. God, thanks. But I think it also illustrates why this conversation is so personal to us. Because if we had to choose, we'd just be like, yeah, just give me the money. It also illustrates why this is such an important conversation, and why it's one that Jesus had so often, and one that God is actually wanting to have with us. So then where do we begin to sort all this stuff out? So Jesus told a story that I think is really instructive. It's super helpful. And it's not just about money, but it definitely includes money. It's found in Matthew chapter 25. It's kind of long, so we're going to read a much longer chunk of scripture than we normally read, but I want to make sure we cover the whole story that he told. So it begins in verse 14, and this is what Jesus said. He said, again, the kingdom of heaven can be illustrated by the story of a man going on a long trip. And he called together his servants, and he entrusted his money to them while he was gone. And he gave 5 bags of silver to one, and 2 bags of silver to another, 1 bag of silver to the last, dividing it in proportion to their abilities. And then he left on his trip, and the servant who received the 5 bags of silver began to invest the money and earned 5 more, and the servant with 2 bags of silver also went to work and earned 2 more. The servant who received the 1 bag of silver dug a hole in the ground and hid the master's money. And after a long time, their master returned from his trip, and he called them to give an account for how they had used his money. And the servant to whom he had entrusted the 5 bags of silver came forward with 5 more and said, Master, you gave me 5 bags of silver to invest, and I've earned 5 more. And the master was full of praise. Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful in handling this small amount, so now I will give you many, many more responsibilities. Let's celebrate. Let's party. Verse 22. The servant who had received 2 bags of silver came forward and said, Master, you gave me 2 bags of silver to invest, and I have earned 2 more. And the master said, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful in handling this small amount, so now I will give you many more responsibilities. Let's party. Verse 24, then the servant with 1 bag of silver came and said, Master, I knew you were a harsh man, harvesting crops you did not plant and gathering crops you did not cultivate. I was afraid that I would lose your money, and so I hid it in the earth. Look, here is your money back. But the master replied, you wicked and lazy servant, if you knew that I harvested crops I didn't plant and gathered crops I didn't cultivate, why didn't you deposit my money in the bank? At least I could have gotten some interest on it. And then he ordered, take the money from this servant and give it to the one who has 10 bags of silver. To those who use well what they were given, even more will be given, but they will have an abundance. But from those who do nothing, even what little they have will be taken away. Okay. So there is a ton of stuff in this story. We actually could spend the rest of this series, the rest of the month, just talking about this one story. Jesus had an ability to say more in fewer words than anybody in history and just pack full a story full of meaning. But there are several big ideas that I do want you to see, because we don't have time, we don't have the ability to spend all month looking at this one story. The first thing I want you to see is that it starts out just illustrating a reality of life. That when we talk about money, we're all coming to the conversation from different places, right? We all don't have the same amount. In the story, you have one guy that has 5 bags of silver, one guy that's got 2 bags of silver, and one guy that's got 1 bag of silver. For us in our lives, for our purposes, I would just describe it as we're all living somewhere on a spectrum between need and abundance, right? That on one end is a place who are people who are living in a place of abundance, where you're maybe not a millionaire, but your bills are paid and you got some money in the bank and some money in a retirement account, and you have some discretionary income. On the other end of the spectrum are people that maybe are in a place of need, where you got bills that you struggle to pay, you got car repairs you can't afford, and every month is just a struggle to make ends meet, and it's super high stress. And probably for most of us in this room, we fall somewhere in the middle of those two extremes. Also, I don't know if you noticed in the story or not, but everything in the story belonged to the master, including the servants themselves. So everything they were doing, everything they were living on, everything they were playing with, everything they were spending, everything they were saving and investing, everything belonged to the master. And this is important because if you don't understand in the story who owns what, it might be difficult to make sense of the story and what it actually means. And I would argue if in our lives we don't understand who owns what, in our story we will struggle in the same way to make sense of what's supposed to happen with all of our stuff. We'll always wrestle with the weight and the tension that we're on our own, whether we have a lot or whether we have a little. I also think it's not incidental in the story that the master gave each a sizable chunk of what was his, and then he just went away, right? When we read these stories sometimes, and this is what the people who were sitting there listening to Jesus, they would have been going, okay, they would do what we do. Who am I in this story? Who is God in this story, right? Well, what does this story actually mean? And I think it's not incidental that the master gave money to the servants and then he went away. Right? Because we often think that, God's like following us around, trying to micromanage, second guess everything that we're doing in our lives. But in this story, he's not. Even though it was all his, he gave them the freedom and the space and even the agency to leverage what he'd given. He didn't tell the guy with 5 to go invest it. He just said, here's some of my stuff. I trust you with it. Figure something good out to do with it. Here's some of my, they did that to all 3. See, part of what we see in this story is that God actually has faith in you. God has faith in what you can and will do with what you've been given in this life, which is pretty amazing when you just kind of take a step back and think about it, right? I think these 3 ideas that we all come from different places, that there's this idea in this story about who owns what, right? And that God's not sort of hovering over us. I think these 3 ideas together are kind of the hinges that this first big idea in what us understanding what blessing is all about, that what that idea swings on. Because living blessed, it isn't based on how much you have. We see that in the story. But it's based on how you view and what you do with what you have. And that's the rub, isn't it? Because we don't want anybody getting involved with what we do with what we have. But God's going, if you want to actually step into what it looks like to truly live a blessed life, a life that my favor and my blessing rests on, it doesn't matter if you have a lot or a little. What matters is how you view what you have and what you do with it, which is why you can be poor and blessed and poor and not blessed. And why you can be wealthy and wealthy and not blessed. Because it's not about how much, it's about the way that you approach it and how you handle it. And here's what I think is the key that really begins to kind of unlock this door in this area. And this is a part of this story. And it's the idea of trust. See, because no matter how much you have, whether you have a lot or a little, Jesus is asking the same thing of all of us. Are you willing to trust me? Are you willing to trust me? Notice the difference between the third servant and the first 2. The third servant was like, I know you're harsh, I know you're demanding, and I was afraid. I don't trust you. Take it and get out of my life, right? We're going to talk a lot about emotions and fear in the next couple of weeks. But suffice it to say, when you're afraid, you are not living into who God created you to be and how God created you to live, even when it comes to your money, even when it comes to your stuff, all of your resources, your intellect, your abilities, your passions, all of that. When you're afraid, you will make bad decisions. I think it's easy for us to look at the story and go, well, yeah, it makes sense that he was afraid that he didn't trust the master. Of course he didn't trust him. He gave him the least. He only got 1 bag. What's he supposed to do with that? And I think part of why we have a tendency to see it that way is that we think it gets easier when we have more, right? It's easier not to worry. It's easier not to be afraid. It's easier to trust God. But it doesn't actually get easier. It just gets hard. It's just harder in different ways. Check this out in Philippians chapter 4, verse 11. This is that guy, Paul, that I mentioned a little while ago. He wrote this letter as well, and he wrote these words. He says, not that I've ever been in need, for I have learned how to be content with whatever I have. He's like, I know how to live on almost nothing or with everything. I've had a lot and I've had very little. I've learned the secret of living in every situation, whether it is with a full stomach or an empty one, whether with plenty or a little, for I can do everything through Christ who gives me strength. So Paul's going, look, I've been on both sides of that spectrum. I've been in the place where there was abundance, and I've lived in a lot of places where I was in need. And he says, and the conclusion I have is that I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. See, we have a tendency to think that need is where it's challenging and abundance is where you just got it made. But Paul says it's all hard, that there's a challenge to both. Now, if you're like me, you're like, I'd like to take the hard with abundance. Please. But here's what he's talking about. See, when you're in a place of need, the challenge is, the hard part is learning to trust God with your worry and your fears and your anxieties, right? When you're in a place of abundance, the challenge is learning to trust God with your hopes and your dreams and your desires. Different fears, different challenges, same hard. See, when we're in need, our fear is, God, if you don't come through, I don't know what's going to happen to me and my family. And my life could just be wrecked and it would be a failure. I've been there. In fact, that was most of my life. My parents got divorced when I was 6. My mom had 5 kids. She was a single mom raising 5 kids. My dad, for the first couple of years, did not have the ability to pay child support. So my mom was a single mom raising 5 kids. We were poor. And there were all kinds of moments in my life growing up where we would sit down. My mom would be like, guys, I don't know how we're going to eat for this week. And we would pray and we'd pray and we'd pray. And then randomly, people we didn't know would leave groceries on our doorstep. See, I know that fear. God, if you don't come through, like, I don't know what's going to happen. So there's that fear that you have when you're in need. But when you're in abundance, it's hard. It's just as hard because our fear is, God, if I trust you with all that I have, honestly, I'm afraid you're just going to make me give it all away. And I'm just going to end up living a miserable life anyway. So I might as well not trust you. Have you ever felt that way? You don't have to say it out loud, but I have. Our family isn't on the abundance side, at least the way that I described it earlier. Like, we're trending that way. We're maybe closer than some, but there have been times in our life where we've been abundance-ish. But even at that, even in those moments, I've felt that fear many times. God, do you know how flipping hard I've worked and clawed and saved and sacrificed just to have a little bit of breathing room? If I trust you with all of it, you're just going to make me give it away. And I don't want you to do that. I don't want to give it away. See, that's the challenge. That's the difficulty. That's what makes it so hard, because money strikes at the core of our lives. It affects our hearts. It affects what and who we trust and don't trust, right? It drives all of our thoughts and feelings. It informs our dreams and desires, whether you have a lot or a little. What's happening to or with your money, you think about it every single day. And you have all kinds of emotions around it. But God comes to all of us and says, no matter who you are, no matter how much you have, he says, will you trust me? Will you trust me with your need? Will you trust me with your abundance? One of the hardest parts of the story that Jesus told for me is the disparity between what each of them were given. It bothers me because I'm like, Jesus started out saying, this is kind of a picture of what the kingdom of God looks like. Now, there are not direct corollaries all the way across the board because you're not a servant of God. You're a child of God, right? So you're not just given a little, you've been given a lot, right? But part of it is like, you know, whether this story is strictly about money or it's about all of our gifts and talents and abilities and resources, it feels unfair. And I think the reason it feels unfair to me is because I truly and honestly have felt like for most of my life, like I'm the one bad guy. And I'm like, that sucks. Like, why didn't you give me 2 bags or 5 bags, God? See, I think what's interesting is I know that people have looked at our lives over the years, and even though I've always felt like the 1 bag guy, I know for sure that people have looked at our family and they've not seen us that way. But that's the thing. Nothing kills our ability to properly manage what God has placed in our hands like comparing ourselves to what it looks like God has placed in somebody else's hands. Right? It's so easy for us to spend all of our time wondering and wishing and working so we can get what they have. And that makes it really, really, really hard to do what's best and right and good with what we have, to be grateful for and generous with what we have, whatever it is. It says at the beginning of the story, we're told that the master gave what he gave to his servants according to their abilities. And at least in this story, the master's estimation of the guy that he gave 1 bag to ended up being right. But here's the principle that Jesus is driving at. That God gives to us according to our ability, but he blesses us according to our faithfulness. That he gives to us because he's loving and generous, but he gives to us what he deposits in our lives is based on our abilities, but what he blesses and how he blesses and whether or not he gives us more is according to what we do with what he gives us. He doesn't bless and honor success. He blesses and honors faithfulness. And you and I actually prove that we can handle more by managing what we already have really, really well. I've spent most of my life, this has been a story that I have read 1,000 times, but I've spent most of my life looking at this going, God, if I were the master and I trusted me with some of my stuff, I would fire me. I would have fired me a long time ago based on my track record of what I've done with the stuff you've given me. By the way, we only think of this story in terms of money, but as I've said, it's not just about money, it's bigger than that. And so if that's the case, what are our assumptions about gifts and abilities? I think they're all wrong. What if the people we assume have 5 bags aren't the ones who actually do? What if it's people that we've never heard of or see that you can't tell on the outside because God's economy is different? What if God values and treasures something different from what we do, different than outward or financial, quote unquote, success? Maybe that's not what he calls abilities. What if it's people who have suffered a lot or had a really hard life and they still love God and they still care about others? What if those people are really the people that he gave 5 bags to? What if holding your family together after your spouse left you? What if that's a 5 bag ability? Raising those kids on your own, maybe that's a 5 bag ability. Getting back up after a devastating loss of somebody that you loved, maybe that's a 5 bag ability. We only think of it like running a big organization, having your name all over social media, big houses and fancy cars. Maybe that's just a 1 or 2 bag deal. We don't know. What I do know is that God is not calling us to be successful. See, here's where what I'm going to tell you about money breaks with so much of what you're going to hear in church. We don't want to hear it, but probably most of us are not going to be financially wealthy in this life. Boo, get off the stage. Right? At least by our standards. Right? Globally, we're all already there. But by our standards, we're not going to be rich. Most of us. Some of us maybe. God will provide for you for sure. But here's the thing. God's heart isn't to make everybody rich. There's nothing wrong with being rich. And we're actually going to talk about in a couple of weeks about how the scriptures tell us that creating wealth is actually a gift and ability that God gives people. But the truth is, we're all not going to be rich. Right? I'm not going to stand up here and say, if you give God, if you plant this seed, it's going to multiply and you're going to be rich. No, that's not in the Bible. At least in that way. we're not all going to be rich, but what we can all be is faithful with whatever God places in our hands. That is this big idea of this story. When I read the story that Jesus told, there's a huge part of it that we can see that of the struggle of the three guys that I really relate to, right? There's the part that comes out of like, can I trust God? Can I trust God with my marriage? Can I trust God with my career? Can I trust God with my relationships? Can I trust God with my future, with my money? Can I trust God? God, can I trust you with my life? And that is a huge piece of this story. But there's a shift in the story. I don't know if you picked up on it, that actually shows up. Where the question in the end really isn't, can I trust God with my life and stuff? The question is, can God trust me with his favor and his blessing? We don't think about it in that way, but both of those dynamics are in this story. And that tension is all over the New Testament. Can we trust God? Can God trust me? Can I trust him with this? Can God trust me with that? In 2 Corinthians chapter 9, this guy Paul, he keeps writing about all this stuff. Verse 10, he says, for God is the one who provides the seed for the farmer and also the bread to eat that comes from the seeds. In the same way, God will provide and increase your resources and then cause those resources to produce a great harvest of generosity in you. Yes, you will be enriched in every way. Man, that's great news. So that you can always be generous. So what is he saying? He's going, God provides for you, and he's so generous, he doesn't just provide enough for what you need. He increases your resources, and he does it so that you can provide for some of your wants, but also ultimately so that you can do something with what you've been given. How will you manage it? Because the whole point of all of it being given to you is to lead you to be generous. That's what he's saying. Oof. The question is, how do we learn to trust God? How do we know if God can trust us? Well, there's some of it comes down to just our mentality, right? Whether we have a scarcity mentality, which is like really the way our culture operates, right? All of like every corporation, every marketing campaign, every ad, it's like the Black Friday mentality, right? That's scarcity. There's 2 at this price, and you're willing to trample people and get a TV and be like, yeah, right? Because there's scarcity, right? And I don't like. Again, marketing really capitalizes. It feels like it's like Ford has truck month every month. But when they talk about it, you're just like, it's truck month. We got to get a truck, right? But it's like, oh, it's truck month every month, right? So on the one end is scarcity. It's like this little pitcher of water, right? Where we're just like, there's a limited amount of water. And so if you come and you say, hey, can I have some of what you have? And I'm like, well, I'm going to be really stingy because this is all there is, right? And so now I gave you some, and now look, I got less. So what am I supposed to do? And somebody else comes along. This, we don't want to admit it, but this is the way we act and behave and believe the way the world works. And it's not our fault. It's because the culture we were raised in tells us this is the way it works. And so you got to get yours. But what if we actually approached life from a different mentality? What if there really was an abundance? What if you were like, you know what? I actually know, you guys are in the splash zone right here, by the way. You didn't know, but everybody's getting baptized today. Just psh, that'll look really good on my report to my boss. Look, we had like 80 people get baptized in one service. They'd be like, what's going on in Idaho, man? But somebody comes along, hey, can I have some of what you have? Oh, yeah, sure. I got a little for you. Boom. You can have that. You know why? I know where the source is. Somebody else, oh, can I have some more? Yeah, you can have, yeah. Belly up. But it doesn't look like you have very much. I don't, but I know where the source is. You can just keep filling it up. One of these times I better stop before I squeeze it too hard, because it was very short out everything and I get electrocuted. That would be really memorable. You guys, does that make sense? Like there's a huge difference. Like when you know where the source is, you can start to trust him, no matter how much you have. You can, I can live like this. I can live open-handed with everything God gave me because I know where the source is. I know, like even in the story, right? That's a huge key to this whole conversation, is having a mindset of trust, right? Who or what or where is your source? If it's the economy, if it's who you voted for, if it's the other people, that's the problem and you need to get your people in there. If it's the jobs market, if it's interest rates, if it's inflation, if it's the American dollar, it will all let you have reason to not trust it. But you know the source of all. Right? When you know where the source is, you can live open-handed. When our heart is set on trusting God, our mindset can actually be gratitude and generosity. Not in theory, not what we say we believe, but actually in practice and in reality. And it's so much bigger than just our money, right? See, in the story, the master has way more than he initially gives to the servants. Because he's like, oh, I just gave you a little bit. You thought that was a lot. You thought 3 bags of silver was a lot. 5 bags of silver was a lot. You should see what I got. Look, I gave you a little bit and you were faithful. I'm going to give you a lot more. When he gets back from his trip, he throws parties and he's doling stuff out, right? For the two that he's given them a lot more than he did at first. God isn't limited in any way. In fact, his blessing in our lives is only limited by us. So that's the question I have for you this morning. Do you trust him? Like, really? Can he trust you with his blessing? Really? Maybe the best way to think about this and how to move forward is asking ourselves the question, what is it that we need to do, not believe? What is it that we need to do on a regular basis to move our heart and our mind towards trust and gratitude and generosity? See, the reason why it matters that what you do is because if you don't do something, you will say, I trust you, God, and I will trust and I will give it all up for you when I have a little more. The problem is more is a moving target. So you'll get a little bit more and you'll be like, I trust you, God, in my heart, but I just need a little bit more and then I'll really trust you. But if you just begin to act and do some stuff with what you have and begin some practices. Just, God, I'm going to live open-handed, because that's the place where living blessed, whatever that ultimately might fully mean that we're going to explore in this conversation, that is the place that it begins. How you view and what you do with what you have. So for me, I jotted down these thoughts this week. I just decided I'm going to okay, God, I'm going to pray these 2 prayers every single day for this month. Number 1, I'm going to say, God, thank you for entrusting me with, and you can fill in the blank however you want, the skills I have, the house I have, the job I have, the car I have, the paycheck I have, the bank account, like whatever you want to fill it in, right? In the story, it was all the masters. So you could make a giant list if you want, or you just want to put one thing in there, you can put one thing in there. God, I'm going to thank, just to remind myself every day, like it all came from somewhere. And the second prayer is, God, how do you want me to use what you've entrusted me to point people to you today? Maybe there are times where that means that I reach into my pocket and I help somebody financially, but I don't think that means that every day. But if I'm living with an awareness of all that God has deposited into my life, all that he's given me, And I say, God, all of this stuff, all the good stuff about my life came from you. All of my abilities, all of my passions, all of my intellect, how can I leverage that to point somebody toward you today? Because it's how you view and what you do with what you have. It's not how much, but how you view it and what you do with it that puts us on the path of living blessed. Let's pray together. God, thank you for loving us enough, not only to give all the things we have, that all the good, all the joy, our kids, our families, our relationships, God, the experiences we've had, the memories we've made, God, the bodies you've given to us, Lord, all of the resource you've placed in our hands. You've been so generous. And most of us, God, we have had tunnel vision on just one thing when it comes to blessing, and that's the number in our checking account, the amount of stuff we can buy. And certainly, God, there's nothing wrong at all with enjoying life. Good food, great place to live, cars to drive. But God, it's not your heart to make us rich. It's your heart, God, that we would learn to be faithful with whatever we have. And so, God, I pray for everybody in this room, whether they're on that spectrum somewhere, God, whether they're on the end that's trending towards need, they're facing lost jobs and inflation and bills that are just so stressful to meet, or whether they're down on the other end where they have some abundance and inflation, they've felt it a little bit, but it hasn't really made a huge dent in their life because they have some extra. And wherever we are on that spectrum, God, you're not mad at us. You're not angry. One or the other's not proof that we're blessed or not blessed. It just simply means, God, that we have to come to you, to trust you. And so whether we have a lot or a little, God, we come and we just say, God, as fully as I know how to do, I'm going to trust you with what I have. Thank you for what you've placed in my hands. I'm going to trust you with my stuff, with my resources. Ultimately, I'm going to trust you with my life. God, my prayer for my life is that, God, you would look at me and you would find me trustworthy of your blessing and your favor. Lord, that the way that I manage what you've given to me would honor you. It would tell a really good story. I pray that for all of us in here. Lord, I pray, God, if there's just ways in which we have built a wall around this area of our life, God, that you would just lovingly stand at the door and knock. God, that each of us would invite you into this space. It's such a huge part of our lives. God, that you can have a conversation with us. God, that we would learn to be faithful with what you've given us. In your name we pray. Amen.